Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wondered how emotions work and what it means for all of us, then do we have the How Emotions Are Made show for you. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, an NIH award-winning researcher and a University Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University, about her new book, How Emotions Are Made. And that's just what I want to talk with her about today, about the secret life of the brain and what in the world it means for us. That, plus we'll talk about Rowdy the dog, chimps and bonobos, right and left dog tail wagging, eating baby bees, infants and facial expressions, mistaking the flu for love, and what in the world fuzzy cheese pizza vomit and edible baby poo have to do with anything. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Lisa. Are you ready to shine?
I'm already sparkling.
Woohoo! All right, before I go there, I've just got to go there, I guess. What does fuzzy cheese pizza vomit and edible baby poo have to do with anything?
Well, when my daughter was 12 years old, we decided to give her a gross foods party. So I thought it would be perfect for a bunch of 12-year-olds to cultivate in them exuberant disgust. And so what I did was developed a set of activities for them that would allow them to imagine, or what scientists call simulate, disgusting aromas and tastes and so on. So I served pizza that I had doctored the cheese with green food colorings to make it look fuzzy, moldy. And I made vomit gelatin, where I took pieces of frozen vegetables and I put it in peach gelatin to make it look. And actually, a couple of the kids, when they went to taste it, actually gagged. Like they had a visible, very authentic gag response. I poured white grape juice into urine cups. And I have to tell you, even though I myself was pouring the grape juice, I could smell the urine. I could smell that indole smell, even though, obviously it wasn't there. But the big event was a game where kids had to identify a food by its smell. But what we did was we took baby food and artfully placed it into diapers, and then the kids, to make it look like poo. And, so we used baby food that was mashed up and had like a dark brown color or kind of a greenish brown color or like a light orangey brown color, like the varieties of baby poo. And then kids had to hold the diaper right up to their nose and take a good smell in order to identify it. And they were exuberantly disgusted. It was very, very fun. And it illustrates two really important concepts that I talk about in my book. One is that an emotion like disgust is not a single event. It's not a single feeling with a single facial expression or a single bodily state. It's actually a whole variety of instances, a population of instances. And the second idea is that, this idea of simulation, this is what your brain is actually doing all the time. It's not the case that you're just sitting, your brain is sitting off, waiting to be stimulated by the world. It's really running an internal model. It's running simulations based on past experience. So it's making guesses about what's about to happen. And then the information from the world confirms those guesses or modifies them.
Beautiful. So many different directions we can go with that, which we will. Before we do that, I was fascinated by this. I'm going to say this with air quotes. I want to know what 8, quote, failures in a row at the University of Waterloo has to do with anything. Because by the time you say 8, I'm going, wait a second, these aren't failures.
So when I was a graduate student in graduate school at the University of Waterloo, I was working on a project, and the project required that I measure feelings of depression and feelings of anxiety. And normally, when you're training graduate students, the student will try to replicate findings that have already been published in the literature and then go on to use that science to test new hypotheses, new ideas. So I started. I was very eager, and I ran an experiment, and I was unable to replicate the findings that had been previously published in the literature. And so I tinkered with the design, and I ran the study again, and again, I failed to replicate the findings in the literature. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll try different experimental design. And I basically went through 8 different experiments across a period of 3 years, where every single experiment that I ran failed to replicate this very well-published finding that that people, when they compare themselves to their ideal standards and they fail to live up to those standards, they feel depressed. But when they fail to live up to other people's standards, they feel anxiety. And in my 8 studies, what I found was when people when people reported feeling depressed, they also reported feel anxious. So they reported feeling both or neither. And I really couldn't figure out why this would be the case. And I thought I had this brilliant idea that I would just objectively measure people's emotions, and that would get me out of this problem. And maybe, in fact, that would allow me to teach people to recognize their own emotions better. And that led me on a path which brings me here to talk to you today.
Toto, you weren't in Kansas anymore.
Exactly.
So why weren't people able, and this is a mind blower, it's to what we would think, and forgive me for saying it this way, basic emotions. You typically think you know if you're anxious or depressed. Why couldn't people figure it out?
Well, what I learned, at first I thought that people just were not good at recognizing their own emotional states. So I was schooled, like everybody else, in the classical view of emotion, that there are a handful of emotions, each of which is hardwired into the brain at birth. And that when one of these circuits, let's say for fear, is tripped, that you would see a facial expression, you'd be able to measure the body, and that there was a fingerprint, basically, a biological fingerprint that you could measure that would tell you objectively what emotional state the person was in. So I first did research to try to understand what the facial expression was, how to measure it so that I could measure people's faces. And I learned that, in fact, even though everybody seems to believe at that time that that fear had its own facial expression, and so did anger and so on, that those configurations of movements are really stereotypes that were stipulated by scientists. But of course, people do many things with their faces when they're afraid, right? Sometimes they, very rarely do they make that stereotype a face, but they can do all sorts of things, including laugh in the face of fear. So the face wasn't going to work. Then I started to study the body, and, is there really a fingerprint? Does your heart race always? Do you freeze all the time when you're fearful? And the answer is, of course, no. You probably realize this. You do many things with your body when you're afraid. And eventually, in the long term, that this led me to study the brain. But I think the thing that I learned, one of the real surprising things that I learned, is that people use their knowledge of emotion to make the emotions that they have, and they use their knowledge of emotion to perceive emotion in other people. So in the classical view, what you know about emotion, the words you know, the concepts you know, are irrelevant. Really, the idea is that you're born with the ability to make these states right off the bat. But in fact, your brain, it doesn't come fully loaded with emotion. In fact, your brain develops so that it has the capacity to make emotion as it's needed. So instead of asking, where in the brain does an emotion live, we would be better served to ask, how is an emotion constructed by the brain? Given that we have a brain of a certain structure, how is that brain creating emotions on the fly? And one thing we know is that what you know about emotion, what you've learned about emotion concepts, is really important to your ability to experience emotion and to see emotion in other people.
So when you talk about learn, the word that comes up to me is social or society or a social construct.
Mm-hmm. So what's really interesting is that little infant brains are not born fully wired like an adult brain. They're born really awaiting instructions to wire themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And little infant brains, in fact, even teenage brains and even adult brains to some extent, wire themselves to fit the physical and social environment that they find themselves in. So this is cognition, the ability to think, is not the great achievement of evolution, if you can say that there is one. I mean, people sometimes think evolution kind of aimed itself at us, but that's not really true. But in any case, the big innovation of our brains is not cognition. It's the fact that we have these incredibly plastic brains that can wire themselves to the circumstances, including the social circumstances. And so the basic thing that the brain is doing is it's guessing using past experience, including concepts. It's guessing what sensations are going to happen next. Mm-hmm. And then it's making sense of those sensations. So your heart races sometimes when you're afraid, but it also races sometimes when you're happy. It races when you run up the stairs. It races when you are trying to solve a problem. It races many times throughout the day. It doesn't, the racing and the feeling of having a racing heart isn't always about emotion. And so your brain's trying to guess, trying to make sense of, well, what does that racing heart mean? And those guesses become your experience.
So I don't want to take you too far off track, but you used an amazing example that unfortunately was given to you in life, which was going on a first date with a guy.
That's right. Right. So, yes. So when I was in graduate school, there was a guy who asked me out for coffee. And, I didn't find him that particularly compelling, but my friends were kind of, urging me to try to have a social life, because I was spending 16 hours a day in the lab. And so on their advice, I decided, okay, I'll go out for coffee with him. And I went out for coffee with him, and I found myself, having these really interesting experiences. Like I started to feel flushed, and I was, I was having a hard time concentrating, and I was, paying a lot of attention to trying to track what he was saying. And I found myself just really kind of physically, what we would say, activated. Just really, I was feeling jittery. And so I thought to myself, well, I must really be attracted to this guy. Like, I can barely concentrate on what he's saying, and I'm feeling really, worked up and kind of aroused. So I guess I like him. And I was sort of surprised, but these things happen. And so we had a perfectly lovely time. Mm-hmm. And then I went home and put my keys in the door, literally put my keys in the door, got through the door, dropped my keys, ran to the bathroom, prayed to the porcelain god, as we would say, and then wound up in bed with the flu for the next couple of days. But the thing is that it didn't occur to me until really many months later that jittery, that all of those internal sensations that I was having from my body probably were symptoms of the flu, as opposed to physical attraction for him. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, the relationship ended very badly. And I probably could have saved myself, a couple of months of grief if I had correctly made meaning of my sensations. But unfortunately, that's not what happened.
It's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. On a different note, this can be rather life or death. I mean, well, it can be it can be extremely life or death. You share an example several times in the book of Saddam Hussein's half-brother. and how he mistakenly read emotions.
Yeah. So I think the main point here to be made is that your brain is taking in sensations from your own body, and it's also taking in my facial movements, the sound of my voice, my body posture, and it's making sense of those based on past experience. It's guessing. Right? It's not the case. A face doesn't speak for itself. A voice doesn't speak for itself. Faces and voices and bodies don't display emotions to be detected by other people. All of that language makes it sound as if there's an objective emotional state that we can measure, accurately and without a perceiver, and that perceivers can be more or less accurate in detecting that state. There's nothing about the way that emotion works that leads us to think this. And as a consequence, our certainty that, our belief in our confidence in our abilities to read people sometimes lead us to act in ways that are ill-advised. The case of Saddam Hussein's brother or half-brother is one example. So as the Hussein regime was preparing to invade Kuwait back in the early 1990s, the U.S. was saying very seriously, not to do that. And the tipping point, really, for the first Iraq War was Saddam Hussein's half-brother misreading the cues from the Americans on the assumption that anger is a universal emotion that is universally recognizable. And he misread those cues. He thought the Americans just weren't angry enough to invade Iraq, based on the provocations that that the regime had initiated with Kuwait, and that was a mistake. And it was a mistake that cost many, many, many lives, both Iraqi lives and American lives. There are examples closer to home that I talk about in the book. For example, women over the age of 65 are more likely to die of a heart attack than men, precisely because when they go to the hospital, physicians and other medical staff, they're guessing that the symptoms that are being reported by these women have more to do with anxiety than they have to do with heart disease. And as a consequence, the women get sent home and they are more likely to die.
Well, that gets into the whole area of emotional stereotyping for women.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in general, the idea is that if it's the case that what we're doing is guessing at the meaning of cues, the emotional meaning of cues, then it's possible for stereotypes to creep in. And we definitely see this in the case of so-called reading emotion in men and women. So in women, the assumption there is a stereotype in our culture that women are more emotional than men, actually in many cultures. And if you ask men and women to describe their emotional lives, women will tell you that they are more emotional, and men agree with them that women are more emotional. But when you track men and women on a moment-to-moment basis, asking them to report on their experiences throughout the day, what you find is that there are no differences between men and women. There are some people who are more emotional, and some people who are, there are some people who, are flailing around, in the pond of life, and other people who are tranquilly floating. So some people who are really have a lot of ups and downs, other people who have more equanimity, but it doesn't really fall out along gendered lines at all. Nonetheless, when we look at a neutral face of a woman, we assume that we see more emotion in her face than we do in a man's face. And when a woman actually is expressive, we are more likely to assume that her expressiveness reveals something about her character as a person, whereas when a man is similarly expressive, we are more likely to assume that he's just reacting to the situation. So his expressiveness is just telling us about what's going on in the world, whereas her expressiveness is telling us something about what she's like as a person.
That seems to me like, and this, I don't want to take us too far off topic, but in the workplace, in meetings, in hiring, in having a meeting over a potential raise, a woman could get in a lot of trouble just for the same emotional response that a man would actually almost be rewarded for in some strange way.
Absolutely. There's evidence, research evidence that this is the case. And I have to say, not to take us into the morass of the recent election, but we saw this play out in the recent election. So regardless of what your own political leanings are, the fact of the matter is that the way that that Hillary Clinton's expressiveness was reported, and a lot of the perceptions of her as being dislikable, as being untrustworthy, as being a bitch, essentially, matches the research perfectly. That Donald Trump's anger expresses his expressiveness was seen as evidence that there's something really wrong with America.
Passion.
By many people. By many people, yes. It was seen as passion, whereas Clinton's, sometimes her serious demeanor was sometimes seen as a lack of any humanity, and her expressiveness was sometimes seen by some people as evidence of her harshness. So I think there's somewhat of a double standard for women. They're either too emotional and therefore not suited for powerful positions, or they're not emotional enough and therefore not trustworthy. And I think men don't have to deal as much with this double standard, and I think they are sometimes rewarded for expressiveness that a woman is punished for, socially or financially.
Thank you for sharing on that. And we may double back around a little bit on the brain and media and what's going on with science in a little bit. We'll see where things carry us. There is a assumption that I have falsely perpetuated on the show without realizing it, which is a comment in the world of positive psychology where you say, oh, that's an amygdala response. Maybe you can share what's wrong with that.
Okay. Well, there are many things to say about that. So I guess what I'll say is the amygdala is like this little brain region is like the rock star of the brain in a way. Most people don't know the names of most brain structures, but almost everybody's heard of the amygdala. They might not be sure where it is or what it looks like, but almost everybody's heard of it. And that's because the media write about the amygdala quite frequently. So it's this little almond-shaped structure that's deep in your temporal lobe. If you take your finger and you kind of put it on your temple and you just went into your brain inwards, you have one on each side. It's actually not even a structure on its own. It's made up of clumps or little groups of cells, so what scientists call nuclei. So it's actually a complex structure. But since the 1930s, I guess, scientists and lay people have assumed that the amygdala is the home of fear, or the home of emotion, or just generally the home of irrationality. Sometimes people will expand that to something called a limbic system. So limbic is actually a term that it's actually an anatomical term that comes from the 1600s, but in the early 20th century, it took on a functional meaning emotion. Mm-hmm. And the idea goes back all the way to Plato, actually, but there's this idea that humans have this ancient part of the brain where their inner beast lives, i.e. emotion. And then we have this prodigious cerebral cortex, which enrobes the limbic parts, including the amygdala, dampens down emotion, is the home of rationality.
We are logical thinking beings.
We are logical thinking beings. And this is basically a myth. It's a myth that there are parts of the brain for emotion and parts of the brain for cognition,
Mm-hmm.
that feeling and reason can be separated in the brain is a myth. Feeling and thinking are brain states. They're whole brain states that your whole brain participates in, and your brain as a structure is transitioning from one pattern of activity to another pattern of activity throughout the day. So that's one kind of myth. Another is the idea that that emotions live specifically in the amygdala, or that the amygdala is specifically for fear. There's tremendous evidence that this is not the case. In fact, the amygdala, if you look at meta-analyses, so if you take hundreds of experiments, brain imaging experiments, and then you combine them statistically so that you can look at the consistency with which the amygdala shows an increase in activity during fear, what you find is that in about 30% of the studies, you do see an increase in amygdala activity during fear. But that's a lot smaller than what you would expect if the amygdala were the home of fear. Even badly designed studies can't account for that percentage. What you also see is that every emotion that we've studied shows, for some proportion of time, an increase in amygdala activity. So even happiness, for example, people in happiness will also show an increase in amygdala activity. In fact, in non-human animal research, you see the amygdala is often engaged in when an animal is seeking reward, something positive. It's also the case that the amygdala shows an increase in activity if I were just to show you something novel that you've never seen before, a scene or a face, you would have an increase in amygdala activity. So your amygdala is not really for fear. It's really coding. It's coding events and objects that are where the brain is uncertain. It's just not guessing very well about what that thing is. And it's telling the rest of the brain, pay attention and learn what this thing is, because we need to have that knowledge to be able to predict well the next time. That's really what its job is. So there is also lesion work. There are these two identical twins, both of whom have amygdala lesions. One has impaired, she can only feel fear under very extreme circumstances. And her twin, who has identical genes and grew up in an identical environment, has no fear deficits at all. So this, I think, is a good illustration of a more general principle, which is that emotions don't live in certain parts of the brain. Asking the question, where do emotions live, is the wrong question. We should be asking, how is emotion made by the brain? How is the brain making emotion? And similarly, how is the brain making every thought and perception that you have, since there are no parts of the brain for different experiences?
Thank you. I want to double back around to that and understand how that affects us. Before I do that, what can you tell us about Rowdy the dog?
So Rowdy is a dog who is owned by a couple who are good friends of mine. And Rowdy, true to his name, is an exuberant dog. He barks, he wags his tail very, very energetically, and occasionally he will jump up on people. Not in an aggressive way, in the sense that he doesn't hurt people, but he's just so exuberant that he will jump up and try to lick you or what have you. In any case, he had been trained. So he's a mutt, and he's from the pound. He was, my friends got him from the pound, and he was trained. My friends are actually excellent dog. They're excellent dog trainers, and their dogs are very well behaved. And Rowdy was trained not to jump. And what happened on a particular day is that my friend Angie, his owner, was walking Rowdy, and they came upon a boy, 17 years old. I don't know exactly, but he was like an older teenager. Rowdy jumped up, and there was no sign of, it was his normal thing. He was just really, his tail was wagging. He was really excited. The boy wasn't harmed in any way. Angie didn't give it a second thought. And then some time later, it became clear that the boy's mother was upset, and anyways, long story short, Rowdy was sanctioned for aggressive behavior and had to be muzzled when he was out of the house. And if he ever jumped up on another person again, would be at risk to losing his life, because there was this perception that, that his jumping was an indication of his aggression. And I think this is the opening story in the chapter that I write about non-human animals, because as humans, we see emotions in animals in much the same way that we see emotions in each other. And frankly, the way we see emotions in our plants and in our cars, and the way little kids see emotions in their blankets. And my daughter had 7 blankets. Each of them had a name and its own personality, But the question is whether, can you really say for sure that, were Rowdy's movements an X-ray into his brain telling you that he was really threatening this boy. And in much the same way that our own facial movements are not X-rays into our soul, into our emotional experiences of the moment, this is also true with dogs as well. In Rowdy's case, he narrowly missed the death penalty.
So how do we not become a Rowdy and start to understand that it's not the where, but the how? What do we do with this information? What does it mean for us, either on a day-to-day basis or how we start to interact with others?
You bet. So I think it means, first of all, I think the general point is that you are an architect of your own experience. You have much more control, not necessarily turning up or turning down emotion in the moment. Actually, trying to manipulate emotion in the moment is very challenging. But more to the point that there's much more to your perceptions and experience than a switch being flipped and you being consumed. You have a lot more control, both as a sender of information and as a perceiver of information. So, for example, I think one simple thing you can do is to pay attention to the context that you're in. Your brain is not just looking at a face when it's making a perception of emotion. It's actually taking in the entire sensory array. So it's also taking in your voice and your body posture, but also the context, the time of day, how much color is in your face, what is the temperature outside. Your brain is actually taking in all this information to try to make sense of the sensations it's receiving from your face, for example. And so, for example, my husband always scowls when he's concentrating, like really scowls when he's concentrating. There's nothing contextually that would ever tell me that he's angry, but it's a stereotypic anger face according to the classical view. Now, if someone doesn't know him very well, they might think that he's angry. And in fact, that can change the entire trajectory of the interaction. And when, in fact, he had a situation where he was in a business meeting recently. And this actually, I talk about another story in the book where he went to a therapist's office and someone said to him, "Oh, don't be angry." And he said, "Well, I'm not angry." And the person didn't believe him because the person had a lot of confidence in their own perception. I think this is a mistake, and it's a mistake that can cost you, it can certainly cause unpleasantness in the moment. It can also cost you a friend. It can cost you a business deal. It can potentially cause a war. So I think the first thing is to be curious about other people and to give up the certainty that you know how they feel, and to take into account as much information as you can, even occasionally asking, like saying, I'm not reading you very well. How are you feeling about this? And I think so it means taking more responsibility as a perceiver to try to get enough information to get it right. That may sound cumbersome to do in as I'm describing it, but it's actually extraordinarily easy to do in an interaction. It means being mindful of where you are, mindful of what's going on around you, of the context, and occasionally asking if you need more information. I think as a sender of information, also you realize that you have some responsibility in giving the person that you're talking to enough information to get it right. So, for example, this is just one example. I was recently invited to a scientific meeting at a major tech company. And I walked into the room, and I was the only female scientist in the room. There were 25 scientists there, 24 men, and me. And so when we were all introducing ourselves, I mentioned to people, I said, oh, and you might have noticed, I'm the only one here who's a woman. Actually, I was a little more graphic than that, but the only one here is a woman. What that means is that throughout the day, I may have to work a little harder to get you to hear what I'm going to say. And you may be tempted to think that I'm angry or that I'm strident or that I'm in some way pushy, but really I'm just responding to the fact that women are typically not, their messages are typically ignored somewhat more than a man's. And so I'm likely to try to make my points known. And, I know you guys probably won't do that so much because you're, all very enlightened. But basically what I was doing is I was calling out in advance, giving them information in advance that would influence their perceptions of me during the day.
That makes perfect sense. So it sounds like there's presence, there's mindfulness, there's contextualness, and there's also a layer of intimacy of being willing to ask, hey, I'm not sure if I'm reading you right. Would you mind sharing with me?
Yeah. And in fact, just yesterday I was talking to one of my research assistants who's from a different country and is male. And I said to him, I'm having a little trouble reading you. Is this to your liking? Are you happy with this idea? Do you want to pursue this task? And he was grateful that I was, cared enough to find out whether, as opposed to just presuming. I mean, I was really having trouble reading him in that moment. And so I think the fact that you and I are spending 5 minutes talking about this can make it seem like it's a really big deal. But in fact, it's something that's very easily inserted into a conversation. So I think paying attention to the context and giving enough information about the context, setting the context, it can really help a lot.
Thank you. On that note, when we talk about people from different countries, a lot of the not literature, but a lot of popular media talks about how, well, I guess it is in the literature. It's the old classical model that everybody, no matter what country you're from, emotions are emotions and they're going to display the same way. And you went, or you had people going to Namibia, to Himba. And this was absolutely fascinating to me because you blew the doors off of the understanding that the way that you perceive how somebody has these different emotions is exactly how somebody else does.
Yeah, so we've now been to Namibia to study the Himba who live in rural northwestern Namibia, but we've also been now to Tanzania to study the Hadza, who are hunter-gatherers. They're actually the last tribe of hunter-gatherers who've continuously hunted and gathered since the Pleistocene.
Wow.
And in both cases, we were prompted to go to these remote cultures because there is this widely touted fact that emotions are universal, that they're universally experienced and expressed throughout the world. And the best evidence for this are studies of remote cultures, people in remote cultures who have very little contact with U.S. Values and norms and practices, right? So these are people who are relatively isolated from Western culture, but particularly from U.S. culture. Now, the number of studies before 2010, the number of studies that had actually been conducted on remote samples was a handful, like under 10. And we felt that the clearest way to test this hypothesis that there's much more variability across cultures would be to go to very remote cultures, particularly the Hadza, who that research was actually occurring while I was writing the book, so it only appears very briefly in the book. And now there's other research by other colleagues, Jose Miguel Fernandez Doles and his student have been, and Jim Russell, these are a group of colleagues, so they've been to the Trobriand Islands in the, Papua New Guinea, and they've also been to a couple of other African cultures, so they're also doing this research as well. And what we found really clearly is that emotions, first of all, for the most part, the emotions that we think of as universal are not routinely perceived by people in these cultures. So when you show them a scowling face, it's not routinely seen as angry. And in fact, upon questioning, it becomes clear that it's not really clear that they experience these emotions as well. But I think for us, they're making sense of their bodily sensations in a very different way. I think for us, though, the key finding, which isn't in the book because we just finished this experiment, is that we took 6 emotion categories that exist in other languages which are deemed to be untranslatable in English, so nobody's ever claimed that these are universal. We made up vocalizations for them that we had pre-tested on American subjects. So we basically just stipulated what the vocalizations for these emotions were. And then we plopped them into the method, these concepts and categories. We plopped them into the method that others in the classical view have used to provide evidence for universal emotions. And in fact, these emotions come out looking universal using this method, even though these concepts and these vocalizations are nowhere to be seen in Hadza culture.
So that means they are universal? Is that what you're saying?
No. What I'm saying is the method is creating false positives. The method is teaching the participants something about emotion during the experiment. And this is enough for these categories to look like as universal as anger or sadness or fear, when in fact these words and concepts and these sounds don't really occur in this culture at all. So the experimental methods on which the claims of universality have been made are creating false positives.
That makes sense. And that's something you go into in detail in the book about how that exact thing took place in early research that then you couldn't replicate for that very reason. Let's jump to kids for a little bit. How do we raise children to be emotionally intelligent?
Well, I think our research and the research in developmental psychology on brain development and on conceptual development makes it really clear that the first thing that we should do to raise emotionally intelligent children is be sufficiently responsive to them, to their needs. So what I like to tell people is that, you and I and every other member of our species are social animals. And what that means is we regulate each other's nervous systems without knowing it. So other animals regulate each other's nervous systems too. So for example, insects, there are social insects, they regulate each other's nervous systems with chemicals, with smell. Rats regulate each other's nervous systems with smell, but also with sounds and touch. Primates that are not human add vision. We have all of that, plus we have words and concepts that serve to regulate each other's nervous system. So, for example, Michael, you and I were talking to each other And we're actually right now, we are regulating each other's nervous systems, even though we're not aware of it. So when you smile, I smile. When you nod your head, I nod my head. If we were
I'm even practicing voodoo behind the scenes. I have a little crystal in my hands, and I send you love, and I send you love as
I'm
a
feeling it.
way to help build that connection between us to keep us in a certain state during the interview.
In fact, because I can see your face and my brain is wired in such a way, as is yours, to be able to, for example, I can't see your heart beating, but I can definitely perceive the pigment in your skin on your face, and which computers can use to read your heart rate. And also the human brain is also sensitive to that information. Also, I can see although I'm not tracking it consciously, you can often see someone's chest rising and falling to see their breathing. So the human brain's taking in all this information. So you and I, if somebody had electrodes on us, they would see that our breathing rates have probably synchronized, and our heart rates have therefore also probably synchronized. Mothers and infants show this kind of synchrony. In fact, we just published a paper about this, about mothers and infants who have this kind of biological synchrony and the chemicals in the mother's brain that are correlated with this synchrony. But that happens between any two humans. If you meet a stranger, by the end of a conversation, if you like that person and they like you and you have a sense of trust, your biological signals will be synchronized with theirs. What does this have to do with infants? Well, when an infant is born, it can't regulate its own nervous system. It's brain is not born equipped with the wiring to do that. A caregiver has to do that. A mother has to do that. A father has to do that. Older siblings can do it. Any caregiver can consistently help the infant regulate their nervous system. And believe it or not, that's the foundation for all learning in a human.
Wow.
It's that regulation of learning to regulate the nervous system is the foundation of all knowledge learning, basically. So that's one really important piece. That the infant brain has to wire itself to learn to do that. That regulation, and partly how it does that is by taking advantage of other people who are regulating the infant. So other people regulate the infant learns to regulate itself, but that wiring is the basis of all future learning.
Well, I was going to ask, how do you help the baby then? How do you start to give it the signals if the baby's not understanding words yet?
Well, so it turns out babies actually understand. Babies can use words much earlier in life than you might imagine, and I guess we can get to that in a minute. But there are lots of ways that you can teach an infant to regulate its nervous system. So, for example, like when you're feeding an infant, you're not just giving it nutrition, you're also cuddling it, you're touching it, you're talking to it. So, for example, with my daughter, when she was born, one of the things you have to do with infants is teach them when to sleep long periods through the night and when to sleep shorter periods in a nap. And so we used cues. We used not just the light, the ambient light in the room, but we had different blankets of different colors. This is probably why she ended up with seven pet blankets. But we used blankets of different colors. We read different books to her before a daytime nap versus a nighttime sleep. And we also had different rituals that we would go through. So, for example, at night, we would go through her room and say goodnight to all the things in her room, just like the book Goodnight Moon. And this was a cue, eventually became a cue to her to be able to put herself to sleep. But in addition, there was a lot of other information that her brain was picking up in addition to learning to regulate itself, to regulate the rest of the nervous system, the rest of the body. And this was the foundation of concept learning, actually, in in her brain and in all infant humans. This is how it works.
Fascinating and awesome. I'm so glad you shared that. So from there, looking at older children, what can we do?
Well, I would say you don't even have to get very old. I think that one thing that you should do, another thing that can help is that you have to try to regulate a baby's attention, what they pay attention to, and you do that with gaze. Mm-hmm. So you look at your infant very deliberately. You can speak to your infant very deliberately. And then if you move your gaze to an object, the infant will follow your gaze. And then you can label that object. And so you do the same thing with emotion. You can start using abstract words that refer to abstract concepts as early as 3 months of age. And the child will use the word to as an invitation to form a concept about that thing. So, for example, as early as 3 months of age, children can use words, even though they don't understand the meaning of the word. They can use the word as a cue to learn complex ideas and abstract. An abstract concept is just a set of things which don't look the same or sound the same, but have the same function. And that's really what emotion concepts are. Your face could be doing many things in anger. Your body could be doing many things in anger. But anger has a particular function, and that's what holds all those instances together. This is how infants learn. So right off the bat, you should be making lots of eye contact with your baby. You should be using a lot of words with your baby. And later on, you should even be, having full conversations with your infant even before they can talk. Doing turn taking with your infant. Introducing your infant to objects and events in the world, even before you see any evidence that the infant is understanding. All of that information is being used by the brain to wire itself.
Very, very cool. Can you tell us, are physical health and mental health separable?
Physical health and mental health are porous. The boundary between what is physical and what is mental is very porous. And I'm not saying this in a mystical kind of a way. I'm saying this in a very down-to-earth biological way. So oftentimes people will ask me, what can I do to improve my emotional health? Mm-hmm. And at the risk of sounding like a mother, I try to sound like a neuroscientist when I say, because backed up by neuroscience evidence, that the first thing that you should do is make sure you get enough sleep. Make sure you get enough sleep. Make sure you get enough exercise, that you move your body sufficiently each day, and make sure that you're eating food that will provide your body with the nutrients that it needs. Why is this important? Because one of your brain's major jobs is to keep your body regulated, to keep the energy systems in your body in balance. When they're out of balance, you're going to feel like crap. Which flavor of crap depends on other things, but you will feel like crap. In science, we call this affect. Mm-hmm. And the feeling, the crappy feeling, the affective feeling, comes from the sensations in your body that occur from your heart beating, from your lungs expanding, from temperature changes, and so on, that you don't have direct conscious access to. What you have access to are the positive and negative, the pleasant and unpleasant feelings that come from those sensations. So if your body is out of whack because you haven't slept or you haven't eaten properly or because you haven't moved enough in the day, you're going to have crappy feelings that are going to you're going to turn into emotions or perceptions of other people. That guy's an asshole. This one doesn't like me. This is a horrible situation. And then it makes it much harder to regulate those feelings.
And it's something you would discuss with me off air before we started is getting up once an hour to move.
Yeah. So, if you're feeling really crappy, you can try hard to think something different and therefore feel something different, but that's really challenging. It often doesn't work. What I recommend to people is just get up and move. And in fact, you can proactively do this. One way to keep yourself, to keep your body in balance, is to just make sure that you move at least once an hour. So get up, walk for 5 minutes, go to the water fountain, get a drink, look out the window, go outside and take a walk. Intensive physical activity is desirable, but sometimes just taking a walk is enough for 5 minutes. Being mindful of what's around you is enough for your brain to regulate your body well enough that crappy feeling goes away.
Beautiful. Have you looked into meditation at all as far as emotions?
So meditation is a really, really interesting phenomenon because there are different types of meditation, obviously, which have different effects. But mindfulness meditation, for example, is very useful because what it's doing is it's changing your ability to pay attention to the fine-grained contextual details that your brain uses to make meaning of the sensations in your body. So by being mindful, you have a lot more control over how your brain is making meaning to create your experience.
That makes perfect sense. So on that note, any other words of wisdom that you would give to parents for their kids? I know in one video you even talk about bullying and what names do for kids.
I think one of the important messages of the book is that words are powerful, but they are a bit of a Faustian bargain. So on the one hand, it's important to use a lot of words with your kids, as many as you can, read to them a lot, talk to them about their own feelings, about your feelings, about what's happening in the world. And that will help wire their brains, actually. But the downside is that words can also be harmful to a nervous system. Bullying, we have this sort of saying in our culture, sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt you. But in fact, names really do hurt you. And if you are subjected to the negative words of bullying, if you scream at your kids on a regular basis, if you are really verbally harsh with your kids, it can actually have an effect on their brain development. Bullying, when it persists for a long period of time, actually can cause degeneration in parts of the brain. That is, neurons will die. And frankly, it's a little bit easier to mend a bone than it is to grow back neurons that have died because of the chronic stress that comes from bullying. So I'm not being I'm not saying people have to be politically correct, and I'm not saying everybody has to be like super nice to each other all the time. Your nervous system is designed to deal with bouts of stress occasionally, big bouts of stress occasionally. What it's not designed to deal with is the kind of casual viciousness that you sometimes see on television and in some school cultures. This idea that kids will just be kids is probably, an ill-advised stance, I would say, particularly when we're concerned about brain development and the mental and physical health that results from that development.
Thank you. On that note, it's a time period where 1 month into the new presidency, and so we are being bombarded left, right, and center, no matter where you come from, with a lot of news, with a lot of name throwing, with a lot of everything. What does that mean for our minds, or is there a way to take that in without without that causing harm?
So I think, based on my understanding of how things work, that we are looking at a serious public health issue with the current political climate. Your brain is trying always, whatever it's doing, it's also trying to regulate the systems of your body. It's trying to anticipate the energy needs and meet them. Mm-hmm. It's also trying to and it often you have to expend energy in order to get energy and so on. So it's trying to keep everything in balance. When you go out of balance, when you're in the red, you get sick. And if it happens for long enough, your immune system becomes involved and then you seriously get sick. You may develop depression, you may develop anxiety, you may develop heart disease, you may develop cancer. The idea that there's this chronic, whenever you have this chronic body budgeting imbalance, this will lead to mental or physical illness. And it actually can shorten your life.
To pause you for a second, if you're talking about the budgeting you're talking about here is if we have a high level anxiety we're taking on a daily basis, we've got energies going in essence to be ready to combat that or flee.
Absolutely. So basically what stress is when your brain is running a deficit in your body. Basically your systems, your body systems are not in balance, and you're spending more than you're taking in, or it could be that your brain is. So when your brain perceives that there's a threat, for example, you'll have a flush of cortisol, which is, by the way, not a stress hormone. It's a chemical that makes glucose available to your body very fast on the assumption that you'll need it. But imagine that you're sitting and you're listening to the news or you're watching television, and you see something that's very troubling to you, or people are being harsh or what have you. You get that flush of cortisol, that flush of glucose, and then you're just sitting there and you're not using the glucose, and it's in your bloodstream. This actually sets off a set of chain reactions that will lead you to become ill, physically ill, in addition to feeling like crap. And so my point is that in a very real way, the social environment gets under your skin. People call it biological embedding. It gets under your skin, and it can make you sick. It can actually even rewire your nervous system in a way to predispose you to being sick for years to come. So I'm not saying this means that everybody has to be always nice to each other and we can never, use a harsh tone or use a harsh word. I am saying that prolonged acrimony of this sort can be harmful to people.
I've been calling it where I've been watching people, particularly my coaching clients, everybody, though, has been getting sick left and right. And I've been calling it the political flu. And
yeah, well, that's a great analogy, and it's a metaphor that unfortunately might not be a metaphor.
Are there vitamins we can take to help us with this political flu, because it doesn't look like the climate's going to be changing anytime soon?
Well, here's the thing. Vitamins don't help you avoid the flu. So in general.
I'm going to put vitamins in quote. What can we do?
Well, I think one thing that we can do is, this is a much longer conversation than we probably have time for, but one thing that would be important to do would be to titrate your exposure to the media. So, and to be continuously mindful of the things that you should be grateful for. Gratitude is a great antidote to acrimony. We can attempt to be compassionate to those we disagree with. There's a Buddhist saying, anger is a form of ignorance. That when you are compassionate and you attempt to take the perspective of another person, that actually your anger just kind of melts away, as do the potential negative consequences of this imbalanced, body budget. But I think also if you're sitting there watching the news and you get this, you have this stressful feeling that comes with this flush of glucose, this is a sign that maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea for you to get up and do something. Sign up for a march, volunteer for, to do something political. We hear in the news right now that there are a record number of people who are signing up to run for elected office. This is actually a fantastic thing. So I think, if your brain is mobilizing your body to do something, one possibility is to get up off the couch and do something.
Woohoo! I completely agree. I call it the two-step, which is one step is go on the inside, mindfulness, meditate, titrate, all these things you're saying. And the second is when you're feeling that desire to get moving, move. So from there, a few quick wrap-up questions. First off, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
It's when I get an email from someone who says, I read your book and it changed my life. So I've received a couple of emails from people now. I'm almost receiving them, I guess, once a day. But from people telling me the way in which the book has changed their life. I also write opinion pieces for the New York Times occasionally, and I sometimes will also receive emails from people telling me that something that they've read really has had such an effect on their life that it's changed their lives in some significant way. For me, that's an awesome experience.
And that's a woohoo! So where can people go to find out more, to find your beautiful book, and maybe even to find your writing as well?
I have a website, lisafeldmanbarrett.com, all one word, and they can just go to that website, and the book, there's information about how to order the book. There are videos that unpack some of the more complex topics in the book, ideas in the book, and there's also a link to all the various writing that I've done for the public.
Fantastic. So glad you joined us on the show. Before we let you go, any last words of wisdom you want to share with people today?
Remember that you are an architect of your own experience. You have much more control than you might otherwise believe, and that can empower you to change your life.
Woohoo! Thank you so much. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get how emotions are made, and create your own experience, and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. This has been great.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!